What if the janitor who has been mopping the floors for 15 years was actually the person who founded the company? Clarice Monroe arrived at the Braemore Holdings building each morning before dawn, wearing her faded gray uniform and worn-out sneakers. Soles thinned from thousands of steps along the carpeted hallways. No one paid her any attention, except for the occasional glance, as if she were an obstacle in their path. They called her Miss Clarice from cleaning, and no one remembered or cared that her full name was Clarice Monroe, and even less imagined that name once signed the founding documents of the company. With a cleaning cloth in her pocket and a cart filled with a mop, spray bottles, and a few rolls of paper towels, she moved through the building like air, unnoticed, unacknowledged. Office employees walked past her as if she were a wall, and senior executives casually chatted by the espresso machine about bonuses, luxury business trips, and Michelin-starred dinners, even as Clarice bent down to wipe the floors beneath their feet. But Clarice didn't seem to mind, or so they thought. In truth, she remembered everything: the words, the jokes, and the subtle contempt they unconsciously reserved for people like her. One time, on a misty morning, she was quietly collecting trash in the 6th floor conference room when a young marketing employee tossed an untouched sandwich next to the bin. As Clarice bent down to pick it up, he glanced at her and said flatly, "Make sure it's spotless. We've got a big meeting at 3. The next day, that same man spilled coffee on the brand new carpet and blamed her for not cleaning properly. Clarice simply smiled softly and nodded. She always did, nodded, stayed silent, and kept working. But behind that quiet acceptance was a sharp mind and a heart that never let go of its past. Clarice had once overheard Vice President Douglas scoff to his assistant, "Can you imagine working here your whole life and not even having a desk?" The words echoed in her mind, not because they were surprising, but because they perfectly reflected how people treated her. They didn't know, or didn't bother to know, that the woman holding the mop had once sat beside the founder, had drafted the company's first financial strategy, had approved every early-stage investment back when the company didn't even have a logo. But what Clarice knew better than anyone was that she didn't need their recognition, because she was still here, and she held more power than anyone else in that building. That morning, as she wiped smudged fingerprints off the glass door outside the executive suite, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A short message lit up the screen. "Ready when you give the signal." She tucked the phone away, her face calm as ever, and kept walking. But this time, every step Clarice took no longer echoed with the rhythm of maintenance. Every step was preparation, a silent declaration of intent. A woman ready to step out of the shadow they had tried to keep her in for 15 years. Before Clarice Monroe became the familiar shadow in the hallways of Braemore Holdings, she was once the light behind the company's very first numbers. Back then, in a small kitchen on the west side of Columbus, Georgia, Clarice and her husband, Jonathan Monroe, sat huddled over an old grocery receipt, handwriting the first ideas for a logistics company that didn't even have a name yet. Jonathan was a man of action, from cross-state deliveries to sleepless nights driving through to meet a deadline. Clarice, with her sharp mind and uncanny ability to spot the flaws in any plan, was the navigator. She didn't speak much, but every word she said mattered. They began with 2 used phones and a rickety fax machine, renting a makeshift office above a laundromat, using a legal entity quietly registered by Clarice with inheritance money from her late father. They didn't buy a house, didn't get a new car. She invested everything into the company. but under Jonathan's name. "Let it be under your name," she said when he hesitated. "I want to be behind the scenes, but I know what I'm doing." Everything went better than expected. The company grew rapidly. Curtis Banning, Jonathan's close friend, was brought in as the third co-founder in charge of partnerships. While Jonathan and Curtis had their names printed in business headlines, Clarice quietly managed the finances, drafted contracts, balanced the books through a subsidiary she had registered herself to serve as legal backing. But then, a fateful night in 2004 split her life in two forever. Jonathan died in a truck accident while rushing a delivery through the rain on I-85. The container overturned on a curve. Just one careless second from the co-driver was enough to take everything away. At the funeral, Curtis gave a speech like a model executive, offering a few hollow words of comfort and never once mentioning Clarice, except for a vague, "Let us pray for the family." But Clarice didn't cry. She stood silently, hand gripping her purse, the one that held copies of contracts Jonathan had signed, recognizing her as the legal co-owner with voting rights in the event of his death. She didn't need Curtis to mention her, because a few weeks later, he quietly removed Jonathan's name from the company records and blocked all of Clarice's internal emails, pretending she had never existed. Perhaps Curtis believed that woman would just walk away in silence, that she would vanish like a ghost with no one left to defend her. But Curtis had forgotten one thing. Clarice wasn't just Jonathan's wife. She was the one who had poured her lifeblood into the blueprint of this company. She could have hired lawyers, taken everything to court, and forced Braemore Holdings to face a lawsuit worth tens of millions of dollars. But she didn't. Clarice simply packed away the documents, locked them in a personal safe, and chose a quieter path. She knew that sometimes justice isn't found in courtrooms. It lies in the patience of someone who waits for the right moment. In 2007, she spotted a job listing on a community bulletin board. Now hiring night shift cleaning staff, Braemore Logistics. Clarice circled that ad with a red marker. 2 days later, using a false identity and a temporary address, she walked into an interview and was hired on the spot. No one recognized her. Curtis was no longer there. The one in charge now had a new name, youthful and polished. Blake Wyndham, a CEO praised by the media for revitalizing leadership. But Clarice knew better. Beneath that glossy finish were cracks already beginning to show, and she had returned to witness every fracture with her own eyes. Clarice Monroe was not a janitor. She was a data collector. From the very first day she returned to Braemore Holdings with a cleaning rag in hand, she had set a rule for herself. Observe everything, remember every word, and never let emotion override the mission. Over the span of 15 years, she didn't just clean floors, she patrolled them. Every office, every hallway, every restroom was a station for gathering information. And when night fell, in the cold locker room on the ground floor, Clarice would open locker number 13, the one people jokingly called unlucky, because someone always seemed to get fired after using it each quarter. Inside was a plastic bag, a black notebook, and a small USB drive. She kept detailed records, names, dates, times, conversations, attitudes, and context. It wasn't a diary. It was evidence. Once she overheard Blake Wyndham, the young CEO everyone seemed to admire, say during a meeting, "If he doesn't like the salary, let him go drive for a ride share. I've got hundreds of resumes lined up." The room erupted with laughter. She stood just outside the door with her mop in hand. No one bothered to look her way. Her handwritten notes read like this: Feb 14. Delivery bonuses cut. Wyndham said, "They take what I give them. That's enough." Room 608. Or June 3. Warehouse accident. No incident report filed. Brenda witnessed it. Another time, Clarice accidentally witnessed one of the department heads use a corporate mart to pay for a dinner over $1,100 for two at a famous seafood restaurant. The receipt printed with the Braemore Logistics logo. She quietly took a photo. No one noticed. She began hearing increasingly cold exchanges between departments. Cancel dental coverage. No one pays attention. Deny overtime for drivers. Blame productivity. Let her cry. No replacement. Still has to work. One night, she saw an employee named Terence Doyle walk out of a meeting looking pale. A week later, he disappeared from the internal system. Clarice quietly asked a co-worker. He brought up the pay gap between departments during a meeting. People say that was the death of his career. Clarice said nothing, but that night, in her notebook, she wrote one line in red ink. Terence, the one who dared, erased. What she had gathered gradually formed a detailed map, not just of wrongdoing, but of a system's psychology that had decayed from the roots. The leadership sat behind glass walls, speaking the language of stocks and profits, while frontline workers struggled under the weight of low wages and quiet contempt. They didn't change because they didn't believe they needed to. And Clarice, the woman they thought knew nothing, had seen it all, from the inside. But every broom has its limit. A small incident, seemingly harmless, would become the spark for 15 years of silent accumulation. And when it came, it wasn't a punch. It was a birthday cake plate, flung to the carpet. That afternoon, the third-floor hallway was eerily quiet. Clarice had just finished cleaning the break room and was replacing the trash bag in the tea station when she encountered something strange. In the middle of the long corridor, under the dim glow of fluorescent lights, lay a lone white paper plate with a half-eaten slice of birthday cake and a fork stabbed sideways into it. The bright red frosting had smeared onto the grey carpet like a dried blood stain at the center of every passing gaze. Clarice stood still for a second. The cake wasn't left on a table, nor near a chair, and there was no logical reason for it to be there. Except one. Someone wanted to see how she would react. She bent down, picked up the plate with her bare hands, gently wiped away the softening frosting. And just then, a voice called out from the end of the hallway. "You missed a spot." That voice was unmistakable. Blake Wyndham, CEO of Braemore, with slicked back hair, both hands in his pockets, and a smug look as if he were watching a silent play for his amusement. Clarice slowly looked up. "Excuse me?" "Right here." Blake stepped forward and pointed to the carpet next to the spot she had just cleaned. "We've got clients coming in for a meeting. I want this hallway spotless." She stood upright, still holding the cake plate. On the floor, there was nothing but the reflection of the ceiling lights. No stains, no shoe marks, just a made-up demand. A power game. Blake looked at her, half grinning, half mocking. "Sometimes I wonder if you people just pretend to clean so you can stretch out your shift." Clarice's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped, each word firm as steel. "You people?" He shrugged and laughed. "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. I mean, if I paid you a little more, maybe you'd clean better." She was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then she nodded softly. "I'll clean so well, you'll be able to see your truth reflected in the floor." Blake chuckled and walked away, thinking he had won. Clarice watched him go, no longer fueled by simple anger. It was something else now, a final confirmation that this man wasn't just lacking empathy. He was the embodiment of institutional arrogance. That night, Clarice didn't go home. At 10 p.m., she returned to Braemore and entered the document archive room, using a security badge she had quietly kept months ago after someone forgot to reclaim it. The door opened, no alarms, no one noticed. Within 45 minutes, she found them. Detailed copies of the quarterly bonus reports showing Blake awarding himself $55,000 for operational excellence, while simultaneously signing off on meal cuts for warehouse workers and freezing wages for the janitorial staff. She printed everything, backed up the files on a USB drive, and left the room as if no one had ever been there. The next morning, in the locker room, Clarice heard muffled sobbing. It was Cynthia, her cleaning shift partner, crying uncontrollably. Her 17-year-old son had been in an accident the night before, with a broken femur. Cynthia had requested one day off to be at the hospital, but was denied due to staffing shortages. Clarice stood up, opened her locker, took out her phone, and walked outside. She dialed the number. The voice of attorney Elijah Dorsey answered. "Clarice?" "It's time," she said. A pause. "Are you sure?" "I've cleaned up more than enough," she replied. "Now it's time to clean the biggest mess." "It's going to be chaotic," Elijah warned. "I was born to handle chaos," Clarice answered. "Start it!" And the storm began to form. Not in the sky, but in the hands of a woman the entire company had once believed was worth no more than the mop she carried. That morning, the entire 8th floor of Braemore Holdings glowed brightly as usual, but no one noticed a very small detail. The familiar janitor cart that typically stood outside the boardroom was no longer there. Instead, the elevator doors slid open, and Clarice Monroe stepped into the executive lobby wearing spotless black shoes, a neatly pressed navy blazer, and holding a thick leather-bound folder. She didn't carry a mop. She didn't need to. Her footsteps echoed crisply on the granite floor, drawing the eyes of the front desk staff, who looked up in momentary confusion. She didn't glance at anyone, didn't pause. She walked straight toward the grand double doors etched with the company's steel logo, the very doors behind which the executive quarterly meeting was taking place. Inside, Blake Wyndham was mid-speech, delivering lines about tightening the budget and restructuring workforce expenditures when the doors swung open. Clarice entered, calm and composed, followed by Elijah Dorsey, tall in a charcoal coat, carrying a leather briefcase that might as well have held the death sentence for an entire regime. "Excuse me," Blake frowned. "This is a closed executive meeting. Cleaning staff will have to wait for the evening shift." Clarice didn't stop. "I have an appointment," she said. A few board members furrowed their brows, confused, just before Elijah spoke. "I am the legal representative of Mrs. Clarice Monroe, the largest shareholder of Braemore Holdings and a legally recognized founding co-owner." The room fell completely silent. Blake looked from Elijah to Clarice, as if doused with ice water. "What did you just say?" Clarice placed the folder on the table and opened it, laying out page after page of documents sealed with official stamps. The founding agreement, a legal recognition of voting rights following the death of Jonathan Monroe, her husband, and previously unreleased shareholder meeting minutes. Curtis Banning, the man who had betrayed her after Jonathan's death, sat nearby, pale and stammering. "No, this can't be." Clarice looked straight at him, her voice soft but firm. "Did you forget, Curtis? You signed this document with my husband. I kept the original." Elijah continued. According to the founding charter, Mrs. Monroe holds full authority to call for an emergency shareholder meeting and request a vote of no confidence against the current CEO. Blake shot to his feet, his tone full of arrogance. You can't do this. You don't know anything about running a company. You think just because you used to mop the floors, you get to own the place. Clarice walked slowly around the boardroom table, her eyes meeting every person without flinching. For 15 years, she said steadily, I've heard every person in this room talk about numbers, talk about optimization, talk about profit. But not one of you has ever talked about people. She stopped just behind Blake. You fired employees for asking for fairness. You cut insurance, slashed hours, stripped others of dignity. And you thought no one noticed because the only witness was the woman holding the mop. Blake pointed at her in fury. You're making this up to get revenge. This is a legal stunt. Elijah said nothing. Instead, he handed each board member an envelope containing a formal termination notice for the CEO, effective immediately, backed by majority ownership. Inside were also documents detailing ethical violations, misuse of company funds, and employee harassment, all supported with evidence. The boardroom doors opened. 2 security personnel entered without a word. Blake turned pale. Looking around for help, but no one spoke. Curtis lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. You can't do this, Blake hissed one final time. Clarice responded softly, without raising her voice. I'm not doing anything. You did this yourselves. I'm just showing it to everyone. As Blake left the room, head down, face hidden, Clarice turned back to the boardroom table. I didn't come here to be the boss, she said. I came to start over, not with the voice of authority, but with the ears of someone who once had none. No one said a word. For the first time in 15 years, every gaze that followed Clarice was no longer filled with disregard, but with quiet, cautious respect. The following Monday, Clarice Monroe pulled into the executive parking lot of Braemore Holdings, her first time ever stepping out of the driver's seat in that space. Not because she needed a spot near the elevator, but because it symbolized something she had reclaimed after 15 years of silence. Presence. Though the lot was covered, freshly paved and clearly numbered, Clarice found it colder than ever, as if it had been designed only for shoes that never got wet, for people who had never missed a night shift, a bus ride, or worked overtime without pay. She walked slowly into the building, nodding to the receptionist with whom she once shared shifts cleaning restrooms. Good morning, Tasha. The young woman looked up, stammering, Ma'am? I mean, Mrs. Monroe. Clarice smiled gently. Just call me Clarice. The elevator took her to the 8th floor, not to mop, but to open the office door of the CEO, its lock freshly replaced the night before. The room still held the scent of polished wood and the old cologne Blake Wyndham used to wear. She sat down at the desk, the glass window before her overlooking the city skyline. But she didn't look out. Her work wasn't out there. It was inside, with the people who had long been forgotten. At 9:30, Clarice held her first meeting, not with the board of directors, not with legal counsel or strategy advisors, but with those who had once stood beneath the steps of the system. Warehouse workers, call center reps, delivery drivers, administrative staff, the cleaning team, and even probationary hires. The room was packed. Everyone looked tense. Some sat with arms crossed, not out of defiance, but from years of being summoned only to be told what to do. Clarice walked in with no microphone, no assistant. "I want to begin with something simple," she said, her voice warm but clear. "Thank you. Because most of you don't know who I am, and I don't need you to. Because what you've done speaks louder than 100 business cards." The room was silent. She paused, then continued. "I'm here to change everything, but not alone. I've listened to you in silence for years. Now I want to hear you speak aloud." A hesitant hand went up. Alonzo, a driver who'd worked for 12 years. "Does that mean we're getting our overtime back?" Clarice nodded. "And you'll be compensated for the last 2 quarters. It'll show on this week's paycheck." A woman stood. Deborah from HR. "What about the insurance policy? It gets trimmed every year." Clarice looked her in the eye. "I'm working with 3 new providers, and there'll be a company-wide survey. Health shouldn't be decided behind closed doors." People began murmuring, turning to one another. Not in noise, but in the quiet hum of machinery restarting after being shut down too long. Someone else asked, "What about the people who were let go before?" Clarice answered directly. "We're reviewing the records. If anyone was unfairly terminated, they will be contacted. I can't promise everything, but at the very least, their names will be returned with dignity." No one clapped. No one stood up and cheered. But something shifted in that room. A quiet kind of trust was returning. And then, from the farthest corner, a voice called out, "Were you really the founder?" Clarice smiled. "I always was. But today I decided it was time you knew." The meeting ended with a simple promise. If you work, you deserve respect. And if you speak up, I will listen. Change doesn't begin with banners or slogans. It begins with Clarice personally visiting every department, having lunch in the shared cafeteria, dismantling the invisible walls that Suits had once built. She renegotiated supplier contracts, reinstated partnerships with small operations that had been left behind, and brought back Employee Appreciation Day, an event once cut for budget reasons, but that had been the company's only remaining soul. One night, Clarice returned to her office and found a small note on her desk. It was from Cynthia, the woman who once sobbed because she was denied leave to see her injured son. On it, scrawled in uneven handwriting, it read, "I used to think people like us could never sit in that seat. You made me think again." Clarice folded the note and placed it in the top right drawer, the only place where she kept memories just for herself. And even if tomorrow would bring more battles, she now knew one thing for certain. Some victories don't need to be shouted. They only need enough patience to let the powerful trip over their own disregard. Because sometimes the one who mops the floor is the very person who built the entire building. In the corporate world, true value does not lie in business cards or job titles, but in how a person chooses to walk in silence or act at the right moment. Clarice Monroe did more than just dismantle a rotten system. She proved that power is not something handed to you. It is something you build, day by day, with patience and a deep belief in what is right. If you believe that everyone deserves to be heard, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories from those who once seemed invisible, and leave a comment with the phrase, "I see it now," to help spread this message together.